Everyone, welcome to this afternoon's Oxford Energy Network seminar. Good to see such a good turnout, particularly from students from the MSc in Energy Systems. Thank you very much, guys. It'd have been embarrassing if none of you had come. So it gives me great pleasure today to introduce Lizzie Oliphant, who is a graduate from our MSc in Energy Systems from the 2021-22 cohort, the COVID group. Who since then went on a bit of a travelling odyssey, really. Went to live in Germany, and I'm sure Lizzie will tell a little bit about that, a bit about what she's been doing. But today, her talk, after a brief introduction, is going to be much more on what she's doing at the moment for Azure Battery Intelligence. So talking about batteries and storage. So I'll hand over to Lizzie and off you go.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Oliphant, and today I'm going to be talking about battery energy storage and how we can go beyond the battery management systems and use and leverage different predictive analytics for smarter battery energy storage. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction of myself and kind of how I got just this point. Oh, yeah. That's nice. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief introduction of myself and what made me interested in batteries, as well as some of the chemistry behind these systems. Then I'm going to go more into the BMSs and what these battery management systems do and what are their responsibilities, before moving specifically into focusing on state of charge and some of the complications as well as opportunities around state of charge calculations and how we can really use predictive analytics to improve these calculations as well as other operating parameters for batteries. But starting off, brief intro to myself. So yeah, I formally am Elizabeth Oliphant, but really I go by Liz or Lizzie, and I really am a California kid. I'm actually from a place called Emerald Hills, which, while it is the Golden State, Emerald Hills very much is the same color emerald as the rock, especially in December and in January. It really is a place that's kind of in the woods, but it's in the heart of the Silicon Valley still. So you get this dichotomy between this blend of technology and nature. And you really get this throughout the whole state of California, with the Pacific on the west, and then Tahoe and more skiing on the east. But then right at home, you have this center for tech. And this right here, right there, that restaurant with all those different chaotic memorabilia, that's a place called Bucks. It's in my hometown. And it really is a place where many different startups have started. This right here is an Apple I computer. So there's been a lot of tales about different technologies getting created right in this place. So I think this kind of starting point really kicked off my interests that have kind of persisted throughout. So my interests in data and how we can use software to kind of preserve and conserve nature, as well as help with other things. So my first step in this journey was going to the University of Michigan, where I studied in the Earth Science department. And specifically what I was doing was I was looking at geology and geochemistry. And a lot of my research focused on paleoclimates. So looking at the climate at the time when the dinosaurs went extinct and all of the different changes that happened in this climate. And my specific project was focused actually on shells. And shells, very similar to tree rings, they record the natural environment. So the cell kind of breathes in the water and the oxygen to then create its shell. And you get these layers where you can see the temperatures at the start of its life, and then later in its life, and all the way at the end. So really what shells can do, similar to tree rings, is they can record those temperatures. There are a lot of biological effects and other problems that happen with it, but it's really cool for me to see that looking at this chemical hard evidence data, you really can infer much more about the environment and other things going on. And I think this really kicked off my interest in climate change as well as in chemistry. And we've all probably seen graphs like this many times. So really looking at modern day climate change, there's a clear other challenge. And in this case, unlike in the paleoclimate that I was doing research on, these are direct measurements. We can tell these with more certainty versus saying, oh, this tree or this shell shows that it was this temperature at this time. This is actually measured temperatures. So we can clearly see there's an issue. And then there's many ways that we can go about addressing this issue, but the obvious one is reducing that carbon output and integrating more renewables on the grid. And if we look at the UK specifically, this is happening all over the world, but in the UK specifically, we've seen there's been a hockey stick in this renewable growth since 2010. And we've reached over 50% of generated electricity last year was from renewables. So quite a strong growth in this industry. And with studying earth science, I saw all of this. And wanted to kind of pursue a route in looking at renewable energies. I wasn't quite ready to leave the geology behind though, and the chemistry. So my next step was actually a Fulbright, where I was looking at geothermal energy, which geothermal can act as a great base load, doesn't have some of the same issues with renewable. But yeah, so I was looking at geothermal energy and the chemistry of different volcanoes in Indonesia. While I really liked this research, and I do think geothermal can play a role in certain economies, it's very site specific. And that kind of led me to the University of Oxford. I really wanted to broaden my understanding of renewable energies, as well as the engineering behind the grid systems and all of the different components, both economic as well as social, that go into electricity demand and supply. So that led me to the University of Oxford and David's course, which many of you, I think, are currently doing. From there, I moved into consulting, and then later joined Acure, which is what I'll mostly be talking about right now. And really what I wanted to focus on was how do we allow this to keep happening, where this renewable generation can take over the traditional fossil fuel generation that we've had. How can we enable this to happen, but also address some of the fundamental issues that are associated with renewable energy. So this is just looking at the energy demand that we have versus typical solar outputs and wind outputs. And there's a clear difference in the load patterns of this. So it will require load shifting. And my Oxford thesis was actually on demand side management. So how can we get businesses specifically to change their consumption to match this better? But the problem is with demand side management, it's very social oriented. There were certain businesses that could shift their demand, especially ones with more machinery or more automated. But there were many businesses, restaurants, clubs, where it's more set in culture when you use electricity and when you don't. But we still need to figure out how to work with these generation loads to match that energy demand. So the answer is batteries. And even stronger than the hockey stick that we've seen for renewables has been the hockey stick for BESS. In the past 5 years, it has increased 7-fold from about 1 gigawatt of cumulative capacity in the UK to over 7 gigawatts now, and that's growing much faster. So with looking at this dramatic growth, I kind of wanted to go into the battery industry because I saw that growth so much in my consulting days. But I also wanted to stay kind of true to these roots in this environment that I grew up in, where we're looking at startups and data and how can we use software, because software is very scalable as well. So I wanted to kind of reach back into those roots and go from there into the battery industry. And that really led me to Acure. And Acure is a battery intelligence company that does predictive analytics. And a lot of those predictive analytics are really about just supporting this, allowing the larger BESS to operate effectively, allowing them to be bankable, and really facilitating the growth of this, because if something is not performing well, if it's not safe, and also if it's not bankable, if there's too much risk involved in the investment, you cannot get the growth that we've seen so far to continue. And if we're looking at what these battery systems actually contain, there's several different parts. So starting with the power management system, this is really what's looking at what is the power consumption, and this coordinates with the energy systems. And then we also have the power coordinating or power conversion systems. This is the inverter that inverts DC power to AC power. But the core two I'm going to be talking about today are these batteries and the battery management system. So the battery is kind of like the juice that you have. This is what is storing the energy that you can then use later. While the battery management system really is that brain. It's what's controlling that system and that battery and telling it when it should release energy. Oh, went too far. So looking at the battery management system, or the BMS, really its fundamental job is to make sure that the battery operates safe. That is its #1 priority, to make sure that it's not over discharging or overcharging, to make sure it's not catching fire or anything like that. But it has to also be compact. They tend to be quite small little computers that are attached onto these different battery packs. And what they're responsible for is communicating, so sharing data with the larger energy management systems and different power conversion systems within that larger BESS unit. But they also are in charge of monitoring certain conditions. So looking at the voltage, temperature, and current. They track these, often they record these, and you can look at that data later, and that's what we use for predictive analytics. But the final thing that they really have to do, which is much more complicated, is they have to estimate the state of charge and the state of health of the batteries. And this is the much more complicated equation. Then often these small computers have the capability to measure actively. Because again, their number one goal is to protect that system, so to prevent overcharging, to prevent that overheating. That's the #1 goal of it. The kind of secondary goal is to keep all of those different battery cells balanced, and then you can use more energy within the system. But that's kind of a secondary goal, and the design concerns really are it has to be safe and it has to be cheap. How cheap is a big part of this equation. So the BMSs are often 10 to 30% of system costs. And if we look at system costs for lithium ion in general, it has been dropping quite substantially since 2010. So if you just think of 10 to 30% of this overall cost, it's not a very large amount of budget that is for these batteries, and they still have to complete two key responsibilities. Yes, do you have a question?
Someone move the Zoom so we can hear.
Yeah, I can do that. Okay, can you see it now? Yeah, good. Okay, perfect. So yeah, as you can see, it was up around 1,500 per kilowatt hour back in 2010. That dropped quite substantially in the next 5 years, but it's dropped even further, and we're much closer to zero than we are to 1,500 right now. But yes, it has to be a small percentage of this system cost as well. So really there is a price constraint on this and it still has to conduct these two key responsibilities. So it still has to communicate with that energy management system and that larger system that's controlling multiple batteries. It still has to monitor and track all of those different units, and it has to estimate the state of charge and the state of health. And you would think that measuring state of charge would be easy, that it's like a drink. You drink a little bit of it, you can tell, okay, I still have 75% left, or I've drank most of it, so I have 25%, but it's not that easy to calculate state of charge. It's not a direct measurement, it's actually a calculation, and it's quite important to measure this. So it's not easy, and it's important. If we're looking at problems around deep discharge, so these can create safety issues as well as decrease the long-term life of a battery if you have deep discharge. And it can be very dangerous as well. There is times when you should not restart a battery if it's gone into deep discharge. So for NMC batteries, which these are the two main types of batteries currently used, NMC and LFP, I'll explain them a little bit more in a bit. For NMC batteries, what we see is this normal range of 3 to 4.2 voltage. If we go below 2.5, what starts to happen is this electrolyte interface breaks down. So what that means is the ability for the system to be reversible breaks down. And thus what you have is capacity loss. Moving to an even lower voltage at 2, the copper starts to dissolve. So what this can do is it can create short circuits, it can create dendrites, it really can risk fires. And then finally, below 1.5 of voltage, the cell really is unrecoverable. For LFP batteries, they are a little bit more stable. You still, though, can have a lot of risks of degrading the BESS if you have any undervoltage or any deep discharge. So typically there is a BMS cutoff that is set around 2.7. But the main part of this is just to show that you really cannot go into deep discharge without risking the safety of your battery as well as the life of your battery. So the problem is that's not an easy equation. If we are just trying to measure, similar to the drink analogy, if we're just trying to measure how much water was drank in each sip or how much was charged and discharged, you can do that as a method to estimate the amount of energy in a system, and it's called column counting, where you're basically looking at how much has gone in and out of the battery. But the problem with that is it's very susceptible to drift. So over time, small errors will compound on each other. And then you also get the secondary effect of you have to calculate the state of health or the total capacity you could have in a system to be able to understand what % of that total capacity you have. So this can create a lot of problems and errors within the system for measuring the state of charge. So there's another relationship that is often used to determine this state of charge. And that's looking at the open circuit voltage curve. So again, going back to the analogy of the BMS having a small computational power, this is a graph that is often hard-coded into a BMS. And what it is showing is you have the open circuit voltage. So this is the voltage if you've removed resistance, as if there was no resistance. So already this is an estimate that the BMS is having to make. And the problem is with such a small computational power, it's easy to make a small error in calculating that open circuit voltage. And if you see these relationships, they're quite sensitive. In particular for LFP, you can see that a very small deviation in the estimate of the OCV can result in a dramatically different estimate in the state of charge. For NMC and NCA, it's a little bit easier, but still it is sensitive. And that's why you can have issues around range with EVs and stuff like that. So looking at these different chemistries, I'll give you a brief overview of what they're used for. So LFP is the primary chemistry that is used for BESS. It is known for its thermal stability. It also has a slightly lower energy density. And this isn't really a problem when you're talking about large scale solar. They have larger footprints. They don't need to be as compact as, say, a car or something more condensed. And it also is much cheaper. So at 20% less per kilowatt hour than typically NMC, it's the favorite for these large scale BESS projects. And it also has some longer life cycles. And part of what gives it these different properties is really its chemistry. So LFP forms these very strong chemical bonds, which can help then make it stable, safe, durable, and last a long time. If we look at the NMC type of battery, this is typically used in EVs, compact BESS as well. Maybe if you want a lot of kick or horsepower in something, use an NMC because it has a higher energy density. So it really can provide that kick that you need for that horsepower of starting your car up faster. But there are concerns around costs. I've mentioned it's 20% more expensive than LFP. So there's issues around the costs with the nickel and cobalt, but there's also some ethical concerns if we talk about mining of cobalt, in particular in the DRC. There can be concerns and risks around that supply chain. And finally, it has less cycles. And part of this is because of the chemical composition. Again, it really provides for that high voltage, but it's not as stable. So that kind of trade-off means that you have to actively manage NMC more than LFP. So it's just a little bit harder to manage safely, especially if it is a lot of units together. So you do tend to see stationary storage being that LFP, and then EVs are the NMC because they need the kick. There are some other chemistries that are on their way. There's NCA, so looking at nickel, cobalt, aluminum, and this has an even higher specific energy, much more of a kick, really used for premium models, Teslas, Model X, Model S, E1 or F1, the electric version. They use some of these. And then finally, we have sodium ion, which is another lithium-free alternative. So it definitely is making some waves because it doesn't involve lithium. But right now it has a lower energy density. Costs are a little bit questionable, depends on how it is made. And this is going a little deeper into the chemistry, but if we're looking at the NMC and LFP batteries, a lot of their power density and stability features really come from their chemistry and the structure that is created within this. So as I mentioned, the NMC has that more kick of a horsepower versus the LFP is more stable. You can see that that's largely due to the ion highways and the way that they're able to move electricity through these systems. So basically, the NMC creates this layered structure where it's lithium and then another metal. And what that allows is you get these quick moving ion highways. So really, the ions can move through this at a higher rate, creating that higher energy density because of that layered structure. Versus in this LFP structure, what you get is this olivine structure, which is more, it's more stable. It restricts the ion movement to kind of a single file motion, which does slow things down, results in less energy density. But at the same time, these are very strong bonds. So if we're looking at the oxygen bonds within this LFP structure, they're very hard to break, which is part of why this is a more stable unit. It is less prone to thermal runaway and some of the other risks that we see in NMC, where you can quickly get things moving through. But this all relates back to this SOC. So really looking at how do we calculate how much energy is in a battery based on its chemistry and based on this relationship between voltage and the amount of charge within it. And as we can see, that LFP is very, very flat. And why that is because the LFP batteries can have two different phases coexisting. So if I back this up a little bit, you can see that this is right. These are moving in a single file motion versus this is like a highway. And what that means is that the LFP batteries, basically when they are doing this chemical conversion, you can have two phases coexisting at once. So it's more of a abrupt change versus a gradual. So in the NMC, you basically have the lithium ion batteries or the lithium ions fully going and everything changing from one state to another, versus this, you have a piece changes, another piece changes, another piece changes, kind of in that single file order. And what that creates is basically there's no, very little change in the chemical potential. So change in that voltage between fully charged and not fully charged. So one way to think about this that's a little bit different than chemistry is if you have an ice cube and you put it in water and you're sensing the temperature around the ice cube and the water. As the ice cube melts, the temperature around the water won't actually change until the ice cube is fully, it won't change very much until the ice cube is fully melted. And that's kind of similar in the sense where this lithium change doesn't, or this lithium potential doesn't really change. So that voltage doesn't really change until the ice cube is fully disappeared. So part of this is just to say that this is a very complicated equation for a small computer to do as the BMS. And it gets even more complicated because there's differences in the charging and discharging for the OCV curves. So this really just is too much computational precision needed for something that's going to cost 10% of your system. And again, the main responsibility of this is to keep that system safe versus accurately calculate the state of charge. And so what we often see are these large error margins. For LFP batteries, which again are the main ones for energy storage, it's very common to see an error range of 5 to 15% for the calculation of the state of charge. And that's because of that small computational power from the BMSs. If you use predictive analytics, if you use more computational power, you can get that down to, in most cases, plus or minus 1%, but pretty much all cases, Akira can do it in plus or minus 2%, by independently calculating, by using all of those different things I just spoke about to improve those algorithms. And part of why this is important is it's not just looking at one battery. So if batteries are in series, basically the highest charge battery determines when the battery stops charging, and the lowest level of charge determines when it stops discharging. So any difference you have in these charges is unusable capacity. And where this intersects with that state of charge calculation is if you have wrong calculations within this, that can amplify differences, because maybe the battery thinks it's at a higher state of charge for one, it stops the charging too early, or vice versa. So basically, those errors can compound and help create more problems with imbalance. And this doesn't look like, in practice, this doesn't look like you have different cups with different amounts of water filled. What it looks like in practice is that you have less capacity available. So this is a real case where somebody came to Akira after 1 year of operations and they said, I don't have access to 15% of my capacity. That is quite a lot. That's not a normal aging rate for a battery at all, especially in year one, where likely it would have been an oversized system and it would not age that much, basically. But if you look at it, that's how imbalances and state of charge errors reflect. They just mean you have less capacity that's available. But if you recalibrate the system, you can reverse that capacity loss. So what can you do? You can have set recalibration schedules to recalibrate those BMSs and to kind of bring them back up to a base level. But that involves shutting down systems to recalibrate that. So instead, what you can also do is move from being more reactive with the BMS to using predictive analytics to kind of give you those deeper insights into what is going on within a battery, whether that be the state of charge or the state of health or other issues you're looking at within the system. And what this does is you basically take that same BMS data, so that voltage, temperature, current data, run it through a lot more computing power, run it through, go beyond just using the basic rules of we cut off here and here, to looking at how does this work in the field, what are past trends we've seen, how can we use the data we already have and have machine learning say, at this voltage level, you were at this state of charge based on this chemistry, and get that much more precise. And then you can really integrate other models into it, whether they be physical or looking at chemical, how batteries age over time. You can integrate all of this data in to predictive and cloud analytics, and then allow operators to become more proactive. And there's several companies that do this. I work for Acure, but there's others as well in the space. There's Twice, there's Validica, there's several others in the US in particular that are all kind of working around similar things with cloud diagnostics. And again, one of the main things that people aim to do is improve that SOC so you can gain that capacity and you can gain the difference right here. And whether you use that for trading or perhaps grid stability, you can have a much better idea of how much energy is in your system, because the predictive analytics are able to use multiple methods. You're able to do column counting, drill down into this OCV curve, as well as take into account these subtle differences in charging, discharging, or when a battery's aged, how that changes things. But it's not just SOC. If you dive into what predictive analytics really can do, it can give you a much better idea of different parts of how your system's operating. So you can identify different manufacturing deviations. And we've seen the battery industry has grown quite substantially. And with that, the manufacturing of batteries has also grown. So with any new technology, there's always a kind of scrap rate that's higher in the first few years of production. So we are seeing a lot of these manufacturing deviations, and you can identify those with predictive analytics. With that same voltage, temperature, current data, you can figure out that there are 3 distinct groupings within this, this system. And the reason the BMS, though, can't just do this is, again, going back to that computational power needed. It's still using that same voltage and current to infer this internal resistance, but you have to account for deviations and how this changes with temperature and state of charge. So it's again, it's not just a simple measurement, it's doing another calculation that a BMS does not typically have the power to be able to do. And with predictive analytics, you can identify there's 3 of these distinct batches, large internal resistance ranges. This one actually was outside of the spec of warranties, so that actually got replaced. And part of why it's important to identify these early is because these small deviations will grow over time. And they'll really be amplified in the long-term capacity, segregation, as well as performance of your assets. And with this, you can look at the battery, but you can also start to get insights into other components. So whether those be sensors, you can see if there's been sensor issues that could create other problems. You can also look at External stresses. So the battery's data, that voltage, temperature, current, again, temperature in particular, that's going to show how an HVAC system is working. Or other things like you could see perhaps loose screws is something else we've seen from changes in internal resistance. And in this case, what we actually saw was a very high spike in temperature that was actually outside of the warranty conditions. And it was due to a subcontractor bringing in a dehumidifier when there was a water damage. So basically what this was able to show was from the battery data, we could prove that this action of bringing in that dehumidifier, that voided a warranty, which was outside of contractual terms. And now there can be litigation, so the owner can actually get the money back from the group that brought in the dehumidifier, avoided their warranty, all of that. But basically with this, I'm just saying that you can see things beyond just your typical battery system. You can look at those external stresses and other problems. And yes, so finally, when we're really moving from this reactive BMS, there is a way we can be more proactive, and a lot of the different companies that work in the space, including here, we use words like improving the safety, performance, and lifetime. But what I wanted to mention was, what does that actually mean? And what does that mean for our over 18 gigawatt hours that we currently support? It's that we're able to turn this data that's already being created, all that data that the BMS is creating, we're able to turn that into insights. And again, going back to kind of my beginning, I grew up in a place that was surrounded by software and data, and I think it's really cool to see what we can use this data for to infer more, to learn more, and really to improve our operations. So what those changes in SFC, calculation accuracy, as well as identifying manufacturing deficiencies means is that you can increase your revenue and you can decrease your OPEX. So just some stats that my company has is, for assets, you can unlock about 6% more available energy by reducing imbalance. So what that means is 6% more that you can trade with, or 6% more that you can support the grid with. That also can improve your trading revenue by about 11%. And you can decrease unplanned downtime by identifying issues as early as possible. You can also identify those warranty conditions that are being violated. And then finally, just overall reduce the risk of your investment as well as operations. And that's really how we can support, how we can use predictive analytics to support this big growth. So we can give the tools to operators to operate these large systems safely, and also we can operate larger systems with less people as well by understanding these issues. And that just allows us to further support this load shifting, whether that be the battery's strategy to support in this load shifting, or alternatively, we also can help with incidences like this don't happen. So I'm sure David knows much more about this than I do, but one thing is voltage instability can be helped by batteries. So we can provide these grid saving services. In this case, it was from renewables as well as a bit of human error why this outage happened. But really batteries could have supported some of the voltage stability and the inertia that the grid needed, but only if they operate when they are needed. So if you have downtime during this or issues with your state of charge, that can also create other problems like this. And finally, there's other use cases though that this could be used for. I know there's a lot of data centers that are developing batteries. This is actually just looking at the amount of energy these different data centers will be needing. But again, this is a commodity that's growing quite quickly that needs very reliable, very consistent downtime, or very consistent uptime and availability. So you can't have that downtime. You can't have the outages that can create the AWS that happened a few weeks ago. So really identifying these issues as early as possible and understanding your tradable energy can improve this availability and also allow you to improve profitability just more generally. Because most assets, this is looking at CAISO, but in the UK as well, most assets are revenue stacking. So what they're doing is you're working in multiple different markets, whether that be those grid supporting services and auxiliary services, or if you're looking at the day ahead or more traditional wholesaling of energy, or finally, if you're looking at more just arbitrage and shifting of loads. All of these are different revenue strategies that are often combined together. And one of the things that's so important is if you're going to operate in many different markets, you have to understand how much am I able to trade in each of these markets. So you can fulfill all of those requirements, which again, going back to that SOC calculation, it's very important to understand that as best as possible. And with that, with supporting these different revenues, we can then just again support this huge growth. And yeah, that's a little bit about Acure, my story, and really it all comes down to utilizing technology as well as data to kind of conserve nature, work towards the renewable transition, and I've chosen batteries and battery intelligence as that path. So